Right, that stuff. Nice.
Okay, before beginning our program this evening, I would like to acknowledge in gratitude to the Indigenous people on whose traditional territories I live, and Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississauga of New Credit in Tikaranto, Treaty 13. Welcome back, everyone, to part 2, Did They Really Exist, with Dr. Stephen Kraft. And in view of the weather tonight, we are grateful for the Zoom option, which will be recorded. Please write your questions in the chat box, and they will be answered at the end of Stephen's talk. Once again, Stephen, thank you so much for the time and effort involved in your research and for your generosity in donating your honorarium to the Engaging in Education Fund. And now for some more answers.
If everybody could please mute themselves because we're getting a lot of feedback, that would be great. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. And just to echo, first of all, thank you, Barb, for your introduction last week and for all the work you've done for this. And I'd like to thank Heather and Rebecca, Helene, all the people behind the scenes and up front here on the Hollywood squares here that are behind the scenes and up front helping out with this and for helping make this happen. Couldn't do it without you, and thank you again. And welcome back, everyone. As Barbara was mentioning, those of you in the Toronto area will know we had quite a storm today, and I really doubt we would have been able to get together in person, even if it were scheduled in person, but this medium has allowed us to be able to carry on, and everybody can sit in the warmth of your homes or by the campfire or whatever, so you can enjoy this in comfort. And those of you that are outside of Toronto watching in now or later, I hope the weather is a lot better where you are, but glad to have all of you along. Because this is the second of the two presentations, I just want to say that those of you that have been with me for the previous ones, and I'll give you the link how to access the other talks in the series that I've given over the last 3 or 4 years. But this one took the most work, the most number of actual hours of research and distillation of information, but it actually drew me back to some of the terrific teachers I had at Associated and Chat, because a lot of the references that I'm going to be referring to and a lot of the original biblical passages are in the early or latter prophets or in the writings and the Ketuvim, the last section of the Tanakh, that I had taken many of these chapters and books I had taken back in junior high, as far back as that, or even earlier, and some later, the latter prophets we did in high school. But a lot of them are passages and histories that I haven't actually had a chance to delve into for almost 50 years or longer now. And it gave me a chance to go back and read some of these chapters, or read about some of these personalities. So again, this has been a labor of love. I've had the chance to, through these historical vignettes that are in the talk I'm going to give, I've been able to go back and reread a lot of the context and a lot of the information that's there. And so in a way, even though it's taken a lot of time, it's also been a very pleasurable reading. And I hope there may be future ones in this topic that I can give as new information comes up. So again, I declare that I have no financial interests or conflicts of interest to declare. And just so you know, in this presentation and in last week's presentation and in the other 8 presentations, that photos, maps, and other references are all available on common websites with the attributions to the authors and owners, just to declare that up front. So those of you that were with me last week, I'm going over a couple of things for you and also for the people who are attending this series for the first time. A lot of the information that I'm presenting to you comes from 2 sources. One is from a couple of articles by Professor Lawrence McKittrick, who's an emeritus professor of history and library science at Purdue University in the United States. And he set some criteria for how to identify whether the personalities that are in the Bible and the evidence for them are actually correct. And he mentioned that for certain different types of historical items, for instance, inscriptions, these have to be authentic and not forgeries. And there actually was a very interesting discussion just last week in the Biblical Archaeology Society. Not them. It was the American Society of Overseas Research, ASOR. They had a seminar on how to detect forgeries. How do they know whether things are true or not? And it was quite timely because this talk has to do with things that are authenticated. So these have to be authentic by the experts who know how to look for them to separate them out from the forgeries. The provenance, in other words, where it was located, and the period of time in which they were identified within the layers of, let's say, an archaeological dig or on an inscription. They have to be able to be correlated within 50 years because of dating of biblical personalities, and dating of biblical events are not as precise as we'd like, but if we can get the agreement to be within 50 years, it's considered to strongly identify people. If they're clay seals, which we call bullae, they also have to be non-forgeries, and we have to know where they were located and confirm their location and their strata, which is the century within which they're identified, and they must agree with the biblical reference within 50 years. If it's a society or political entity, it has to be attributed by the Bible and the artifact. They must match in terms of their name and the era in which they existed. And he also said that there have to be 3 quote unquote marks on the item that have to match. So a name and a father, for instance, a name, the identity of a king, a regent, vassal, servant, and so on, or scribe, and the location. So there have to be correlations that are fairly strong, and at least 2 or even 3 sources in addition to the Bible to identify them. So how many people that are named in the Bible do we know for sure existed by the criteria that the Professor Mikitiuk has put forward? From his articles, he put forward 53 people that have been identified, and 10 that are what are called tentative, meaning that they have very strong evidence that they exist, but maybe not satisfied all 3 quote unquote marks that he listed. If you go to Wikipedia online and put in a identifier, biblical personalities who are identified, you'll come up with a website that I'm going to again give you later on, and which I actually checked as of this past week. So this is current, up to date. They had 41 people confirmed and 29 tentative. And when you look at the people who are common to both lists, both Professor Mikitiuk's and also Wikipedia source, it turns out that combined there are 57 personalities. In other words, there's 4 identified by Wikipedia online that are not in his list. So in combining the 2 lists, there's 57 identified, 24 tentative between the 2 lists, and 3 others that are pretty strong, and a couple of them I'm going to show you at the end. So as you know, with my talks, I try to keep you in suspense. So there's going to be a couple of surprises near the end, people that I think have been identified but aren't on either of their lists, and I'll have to show you that later. Now, the categories I showed you last week, these are the categories of the different states or kingdoms in which these people existed. So last week we discussed the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Israel, and also the pharaohs of Egypt and the Moabite kings who are identified in the Bible. And today we're going to deal with the other states. So I also made one disclaimer last week, and that you're going to see before you complain and give me a chat question, there are no women in the list. Unfortunately, all 84 or 87 people are male. And that's because, remember, there had to be 3 identifying cross-references. and the evidence is not available yet. But as I pledged last week, and I will give Barbara to give me the freedom to bring a third text, if over the next several months or years, that identification of women in the Bible comes forth and confirmed by these experts and archaeologists, I will ask for an immediate, urgent meeting, and we can present the data on the women. So far, we don't have any confirmed women, but we have several astute women archaeologists who are involved in this process, as I'll show you later. So here are the two parts that I separated into our part 1 and part 2 for this presentation. And we're going to deal with the part 2, including 4 tentative people that I think you'll find quite interesting. So the first is the kingdom of Aram Damascus. And here are the personalities in the Bible that have been confirmed. And just to give you a little frame of reference, we're not going to deal with every single person, otherwise we'll be here till midnight. But I'm going to select ones that I think are of interest, people that have a significant impact on the Jewish side of the history in the Bible, and people that you've probably heard of and are quite significant personalities. So I'm just going to deal with 2 in this group. Ben-Hadad, who we did meet. We met him, as you'll see, when we discussed a couple of the kings of Judah and Israel last week, and his son Hazael. So Ben-Hadad, the son of Hadadezer, also interesting in the Bible, the father is listed by the name Tavrimon. So it's interesting whether who's the actual name of the father. And he reigned in the 9th century BCE. There is the kingdom of Aram Damascus, just abutting the north kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And he ruled from Damascus, which is a very, very ancient city, as you know, and it's located there within the circle. And the biblical reference, as I mentioned, gives his name of the father as Tavrimon, listed in 1 Kings. So there is Damascus in the same location as Damascus in modern history. Now, the 2 kingdoms, kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah, I didn't remember this, but when I was rereading and having this pleasure of rereading some of these sources in the first or early prophets, I had forgotten that these 2 kingdoms, after they separated, were constantly at war with each other. So for the 200 years that the kingdom of Israel existed, it was constantly at war. There were repeated wars between the kings of these 2 states. And in one of these wars, the king of Judah at the time, by the name of Asa, and I'm giving you all, with each of these personalities, I'm giving you the Hebrew name as it is in the Bible. And the king of Judah, Asa, gave gifts to this Ben-Hadad, as it's listed in the Bible, to get him to help win the war against the king of Israel at the time, whose name was Baasha. But Ben-Hadad then, after that battle, then went ahead and decided to attack several cities in Israel himself, including Dan, which is in the north. And this is noted in the Tel Dan inscription, which I'm showing you here. And this is one of the sources that I referred to last week. And in that inscription, as the corroboration of his existence, is the name Hadad. The question is that when you look at the original reference, and by the way, this is where the reference to the house of David, we talked about David last week and the evidence of his existence. The house of David is clearly known from this inscription, but Hadad is also mentioned here and here. Now the question is this Hadad a storm god? Because there's also a storm god from the Aramaean sources by that name, or is it actually King Hadad of Aram? And we know that he helped this war in 890 BCE between these kings of Judah and Israel. But if indeed his name is verified as having been in this Tel Dan inscription, then it's verifying his existence. Now, I'm going to show you this. This is something that is, as I mentioned, was just another reference that I just saw 2 days ago, is that this Tel Dan, the entire excavation and the findings are now on a simulation, a 3D virtual simulation put together by the University of California, San Diego. And very soon it's going to be uploadable. And what it's done is actually give you a 3D version of the excavation and all of the findings there, including the discovery of this Tel Dun inscription. This has just come out 2 days ago. And you can see that it's actually in 3D, and it shows you the excavation and the discoveries. And they actually took the simulated voice of the discoverer. This is Abraham B. Run, who we discussed last week. They actually took his original voice. Now, he's been gone for over 15 years, but they took his voice and actually put it in as a narrator for this 3D virtual tour. So this is going to be something quite spectacular, and you're going to get the voice of the original excavator simulated in this at some point. So he, as I mentioned, he gathered his troops and laid siege on Shomron, which was the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. And his death was prophesied by Elisha the prophet, and then he was succeeded by his son Hazael. And that's referenced in both the first and second book of Kings. So Hazael also reigned from Damascus, as I've circled here, the kingdom of Aram, Damascus. He reigned for quite a long period of time, and he was anointed by the prophet Eliyahu, Elijah. And it's also described in the early prophets. And he also was told to anoint the king of Israel, whose name was Yehu. And I'm going to show you that he's also a possible, or at least a tentative, identification as well. Hazael is identified in 3 contexts. Some interesting that he's actually attested to by some inscriptions from a couple of islands in Greece. And then there's also some ivories called the Argian Tash ivories from northern Syria that mention his name. But the most convincing identification is from what's called the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, which is in the British Museum, which was found in Nimrud. And I'm going to show you where Nimrud is. Nimrud is a famous name going back to early Genesis. And this obelisk was found by the British archaeologist Layard. His image from a painting is shown you here. And you can see this is the actual obelisk in the British Museum with panels on all 4 sides. And it tells of the deed of this King Shalmaneser III. He's not the Shalmaneser that's in the Bible, but his exploits in this obelisk tell about his defeating Hazael, this king of Aram Damascus. It actually shows images of his capture of this king. And it also, as I mentioned, it actually in one of the frames shows a tribute here at the bottom by this king of Israel, which is identified as Yal. And many archaeologists feel that this is actually the transliteration of the name of Yehu or Jehu, who is the king at the time. So as I mentioned, this may actually identify this king as also having existed by this obelisk. And as I did last week, when we enter into a new topic, I'm showing you some other ventures into history. These are not biblical figures, but just to keep you interested and engaged, I show you this photo. I don't know how many of you will identify this gentleman, but this is Alfred Hitchcock from a little over 100 years ago. We're moving now to the Kingdom of Assyria. The Kingdom of Assyria has several personalities who are mentioned in the Bible. And we're only going to deal again with the ones that I think are the most interesting or the most famous and well known to you and had the biggest impact on Jewish history. And these are the 4 that we're going to discuss. The most famous of these are Sancheriv, number 4, and Tiglath-Pileser III, who has a nickname of Pul, and he's named in both ways in the Bible by Tiglath-Pileser and also Pul. He is identified in several sources. Earliest is the second book of Kings. He reigned for 18 years, and it's interesting that the inscription that I mentioned, the Tel Dun inscription that we discussed just a few minutes ago and last week, was found in a destruction layer from the time that he was invading Israel. So when Tiglath-Pileser III invaded Israel and destroyed several of the cities, one of the cities was in Dan, and the inscription that has caused all this fuss about the identity of David and Hazael and so on, this inscription was actually from a destruction layer from the time that he was in Israel. This is an alabaster relief from his palace, which was in Nimrud, which was his capital. It's currently in the Louvre in Paris. And it discusses how he captured several cities in the North Kingdom, which was Israel, and exiled the captives to Assyria. Now that story is probably ringing in your ears. Well, this is the invasion of the Kingdom of Israel, and this is the early exile of the 10 tribes of Israel. So when we talk about the lost 10 tribes, it was as a result of the invasion by Assyria, predicted by the latter prophets, by the way. The prophets actually predicted the invasion of Assyria from the north. From the north will the invasion occur. And this is the first of the several years process of the exile of the tribes of Israel and their capture and exile to Assyria. And he mentions 2 kings. We discussed these 2 kings last week. So this is part of the corroborating evidence for these 2 kings, Pechach ben Remaliahu and Hoshea. And this is the alabaster of him. And so he's identified as well from various inscriptions at the time. The other king that has direct relevance to us in this same era is Shalmaneser V, not the one that we had a few slides ago. This is 2 Shalmanesers later. And in the second book of Kings, it describes what he captured. And he captured the capital of Shomron and subjugated the king Hoshea, which is portrayed in this alabaster relief of this king, Shalmaneser V. This is him, and they often are portrayed, these kings from these states are often portrayed, with a beard and a cape and a helmet, and it's a very famous motif. So he's identified here, but he is subjugating Hoshea in one of these reliefs. But this particular relief shows him with the Tiglath-Pileser III on the palace of Tiglath-Pileser III, which was found in Nimrud. And his exploits are also recorded in a series of what are called the Babylonian Chronicles, which are in cuneiform. One of them is on the right from the British Museum. They were discovered in ancient Babylon, and I'm going to show you on a map where these places are. And it documents Babylonian history over several centuries, and it includes the name of Shalmaneser V. Another king that is very well known, and many of you have probably heard of, is Sargon II in this particular context. He's referred to in the book of Isaiah or Yeshayahu, who reigned as a king subsequent to the other 2 when the exile had already occurred and the capture of the kingdom of Israel. He was the son of Tiglath-Pileser III, and Isaiah actually describes how he captured Ashdod, which is an ancient city and is in the same location as the current Israeli city of Ashdod. And he is documented here in a relief from Khorsabad, which is now in Iraq. And it's in annals of, again, the 2 kings we discussed before, Tiglath-Pileser, and his own annals also from 722 BCE at the time of the capture of Israel and the exile of the 10 tribes. And what had happened was that Israel actually revolted against Assyria, despite the warnings of the prophets of the time. And as a result, Assyria came, quelched the revolt, and captured Israel and exiled the citizens. And here is in the map, you can see this is where Khorsabad is, the kingdom of Sargon II. And we mentioned Nineveh, we also mentioned Nimrud, and they are other capitals used by other kings and are just to the west of it, circled in green. And then on the right, you can see a reconstruction of the original palace of Sargon II in Khorsabad. The last of the kings that I wanted to discuss was Sancheriv, and he is known from a couple of sources. He's listed in Chronicles, in chapter 32, second book of Chronicles. And his name is in a rock relief from a city in southeastern Turkey, which you can see on the map here. And he's also known from what's called the Sancheriv Prism. And we discussed this last week with references for other biblical characters. And his prism was discovered in Nineveh, the first of three. There's three prisms, three copies of this prism exist. One is in London, one is in Chicago, and one is in Jerusalem. This is the one in the British Museum. And it was discovered by Colonel Robert Taylor, a British military person. And it's written in Akkadian, cuneiform, and it talks about his military campaigns of Sancheriv, including capturing 40 cities in the kingdom of Judah. And there's a famous story where he could not capture Jerusalem. So of all the cities that he was capturing, he could not capture Jerusalem because of a plague outside the walls. And this is a very famous story that's accounted in Isaiah, and it's also accounted in the second book of Kings. And we talked about this in reference to King Hezekiah, because this is a reference to actually one of the kings of Judah, Hezekiah. And although he couldn't capture Jerusalem, in the prism, it actually describes Hezekiah as being shut up in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. So while the city was not captured, certainly it was under siege for a long period of time, attested to by this prism. And after he returned to his capital, he was actually assassinated by two people also mentioned in the Bible, Adramelech and Sharezer. And Adramelech is actually identified, so he's one of the people who is actually identified as with evidence of his existence, and it's from various texts written by the king Ashurbanipal, who's very famous as well. We're not going to be discussing him, but his name in the Bible also appears as the name Osnapar. So before we get into our next group of kings and personalities, this person may be quite absolutely. This is Paul Newman during his naval service in the 1940s. We're hitting now the kingdom of Babylonia. Some very famous personalities here, and these are the personalities from the kingdom of Babylonia who are identified in the Bible and also whose existence is corroborated. And I was just going to talk about Nebuchadnezzar, who is very, very famous. Many of you probably recognize that name. His name is also Nebuchadrezzar, depending on where in the Bible you find his name. And Belshazzar, a very famous story, a famous encounter with Daniel. So we're going into the Ketuvim, into the writings to get the reference for him. But there's two other royal officials, and I put their names in because they are the most recent identified personalities from within the last few years. So these are the individuals we're going to discuss, starting with Nebuchadnezzar, first identified in the second book of Kings. He is the king, the Babylonian king who destroyed the first temple, and that's why I've included him. He's probably well known to you, but when we talk about the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians, this is the king who is identified with that conquest. And he reigned over the largest extent of the Babylonian Empire in ancient history. And if you need to know, we're going to mention the location of Babylon. And this is the location within his kingdom of his capital. The Bible talks about a rebellion by the king Jehoiakim against Babylon in his third year of his reign, continued on by his son Jehoiachin, and it brought Nebuchadnezzar to attack Jerusalem and seize the treasures of the temple. So the rebellions by these two kings, the father and the son, was a total disaster. And not only that, when Nebuchadnezzar was there, he destroyed the temple and he instilled his own vassal by the name of Mattaniah as the new king. And he forced the emigration, and this is the beginning of the Babylonian exile, and it was instigated by this king. There's corroboration also through the Bible of both in several locations from the early and through the latter prophets and also in the Ketuvim. due to the evils practiced by Judah, the prophet Ezekiel, who is mentioned, said that God would punish the kings, and Nebuchadnezzar, sure enough, as the story goes, came and invaded Jerusalem. And Daniel, in his first chapter, in the first verse, describes the siege of the city during the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim. So the actual destruction is attested to by Daniel. And the prophet Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, prophesied that in the fourth year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, he would also defeat the Egyptian pharaoh Necho. Now, we met Necho last week, one of the pharaohs who is identified in the Bible, at a site called Carchemish. And this is a very famous battle site in biblical times. And so when Babylonia defeated Egypt, this was the site. There's the site of Carchemish, where Nebuchadnezzar defeated the pharaoh Necho, again, another personality identified in the Bible. And we identify Nebuchadnezzar from the Bible, but also from a clay tablet that was unearthed in his capital in Babylon, an Akkadian inscription that identifies him by name. We also know of him from the capital, Babylon, of what's called the Ishtar Gate, one of the several gates leading into the city. And you can see it's a beautiful reconstruction. This is the original gate that was reconstructed in the Berlin Museum. And on it, on the bottom, you can see an inscription that also identifies this pharaoh as the one who built this gate and built many of the walls that were found protecting the city. It was identified and excavated by Robert Coldaway, and this was the restored gate that he brought back to the Berlin Museum. And I mentioned just in brief these two officials, which are the most recent members, new members, I guess, of the all-star team, if you want. The two officials, Nebuchadnezzar and Nebuzaradan and Nergal-Sharezer, I just mentioned them because both of them were involved, identified in the Book of Kings, Part II, and in Jeremiah, as having helped lead the military attack on Jerusalem during the reign of King Tzidkiah of Judah. And they're both confirmed in Babylonian cuneiform inscriptions that were actually discovered in the 1930s, but their identity wasn't really identified. They weren't really identified until more recent times when people went back and looked at the inscriptions, and I guess it was overlooked by the original discoverers, but eventually the text was translated and their names came to light and are now identified. And Belshazzar is the last of the personalities I wanted to deal with from Babylonia. Belshazzar was the son of the king at the time. Now, this king, Nabonidus, is not in the Bible. He's identified, he's known from Babylonian sources, and he reigned for 14 years, but he did not intersect with the writers of the Bible or with some of the personalities in the Bible. But he had a son by the name of Belshazzar, and Belshazzar ruled over Babylonia for a short period of time while his father was leading a military campaign abroad. He's also a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar that we discussed earlier, and Belshazzar's name is on what is called the Nabonidus cylinder from Ur. Now, there's two cylinders by the same name from two different locations under the same king. But this is one discovered in the city of Ur in the south part of the country, of the state. And this one actually mentions Belshazzar by name. And where he intersects with the Bible is in the book of Daniel in a very famous scene where he challenged his local wise men to read some mysterious writing that suddenly appeared in the wall in his palace. This is the Hebrew, the original Hebrew is Mene Mene Tekel Upharsin, and it was Daniel who actually was able to identify what this meant. And unfortunately, it meant the king's demise. And so he was able to figure out what this phrase meant. And sure enough, that night, Belshazzar, who was leading a battle against the Persians who were led by Darius I, lost the battle and lost his life. So this was predicted by Daniel from these words, and that's where this famous scene of Belshazzar occurred. And these cylinders were discovered by an archaeologist by the name of Taylor in the Ziggurat of Ur, which is a famous landmark in one of the temples there, which is in the British Museum. And this is where it's located. This is the Ziggurat of Ur, again, a very, very famous landmark from the ancient world. This is the ziggurat and the Nabota cylinder from that location, located here in the south part of the country. Before our final country that we'll deal with, I'm showing you again, these are not biblical figures. One of them I think you'll identify quite easily. This is actually a silver etching from a photograph by a very famous photographer who did a lot of the well-known personalities of the time. His name was Matthew Brady, and he had a studio in the area of Washington, D.C. And he did portraits of many of the famous personalities of the time, including presidents, vice presidents, and other people. And he managed to get into a studio. These two gentlemen on the right, I think you'll identify who that is, future president. But how many of you will identify the gentleman on the left who was in the studio at the same time?
Stephen Douglas?
Nope. So if you've never seen a photo of Edgar Allan Poe, I think it's one of the very few in existence. So it's Edgar Allan Poe, who was actually a friend of Abraham Lincoln's, and he happened to be visiting Washington, and Senator Lincoln invited him to come have a portrait done in Matthew Brady's studio. Okay, our next state is Persia. Now, just before we go on, I see there's something in the chat. Do you want to stop for a moment? What is in the chat? Is cuneiform the same as Judeo-Arabic script? Not that I know of. I believe they are different scripts, but I stand to be corrected. Okay. Personalities in the Bible. We are now in the kingdom of Persia. And there's several people identified as well. And we're going to deal with these four individuals. Again, these are people that, well, three of them I know you'll know right away, and we'll deal with them. But the other one you may not know. But the third one, Tatanai, is one of the most recent identified characters as well. And I will just mention him in just a moment. We're going to start with Cyrus II, the Great. In Hebrew, he was identified in the Bible in Chronicles as Koresh Melech Paras, specifically identifying the kingdom from which he came. And he's referenced in several sources in the Tanakh, reigned for a long period of time and was king of the Achaemenid Empire, which is labeled here. You can see that it actually supplanted the previous kingdoms and extended into Egypt. And he ruled from a capital city of Pasargadae, which is located in southwestern Iran. It's located down here, and I'll show it to you on a better map in just a moment. So in these three sources, Cyrus II, Cyrus the Great, whose name was Koresh, was the one who allowed the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild the temple. And actually, he didn't just allow the Jews. His edict was to allow all peoples who wanted to return from exile to their original locations, their original countries, to be able to rebuild their lives and their temples. He was a very liberal-minded man who allowed this to occur, and the Jewish exiles who wished to return to Judah, as you know, many of them did not, but those that did return to Judah had the permission from him and from Darius, actually, to rebuild the temple.
That's what they call Shivat Zion.
Exactly right. Exactly right. So and in Isaiah, it's quoted that God will give Cyrus the strength to open doors and not close gates. So this was the mantra that he had as his kingdom. And Daniel in chapter 1 accounts that Daniel, lived until year 1 of Cyrus's rule. So this actually gives you the exact dating of Daniel's life. So very interesting. So I was going to give you the location of his capital city is there in the south central part of the kingdom of Persia. These are photos of the ruins of his capital and his tomb. This is Cyrus's tomb discovered in that location. The excavations there were carried out by an archaeologist from Iraq by the name of Hormuz de Rassam. And he also identified what was called the Cyrus cylinder. So we've got all these, we've got the Nabonidus cylinder, we got all these cylinders and other etchings that we have, inscriptions. This is in the British Museum. And the Cyrus cylinder, of course, directly identifies Cyrus. So there's no question that he existed. And it's dated to 539 BCE and was found in the ruins of Babylon in 1879 by this Iraqi archaeologist. And it describes his restoring of several temples that were sacked by the Babylonian king Nabonidus. So when Babylon was in charge of the region, they destroyed many of the Persian temples, but Cyrus restored them, and it's accounted for in this particular cylinder and dedicates his deeds to pleasing Marduk, the king. And this is the another bas-relief that identifies Cyrus the Great. And Dariavesh in the Bible is identified in one of the lesser prophets. We haven't mentioned his name yet, but in Haggai, in the very first sentence, it identifies the time of his prophecy and names Dariavesh in year 2 of the reign of Dariavesh. So we can actually date the life of Haggai, the prophet. And in Ezra, there's actually a copy of a letter that was sent to King Darius by this scribe by the name of Tattenai, and also by a colleague by this name, which accounted the rebuilding of the temple, and they were overseeing this reconstruction on behalf of the kings of Persia. And Darius is portrayed on a very famous inscription called the Behistun inscription, which was found in the one of the western provinces of modern-day Iran. And that's labeled here. This is the western province where this inscription was found. This is the mount where it was found. And it's actually very much like the Rosetta Stone. If you are familiar with the Rosetta Stone, which had the 3 languages, 2 different forms of hieroglyphics from Egypt, as well as ancient Greek. And it was the vehicle, the inscription with which Champollion was able to decipher hieroglyphics and opened up the whole field of Egyptology in 1822. So similar to that seminal event where languages suddenly were able to be translated and it opened up a whole new era of archaeology, the same thing here. This particular inscription is in 3 languages, one of which was never able to be translated until the discovery of this inscription. And while Babylonian and Persian were known, Elamite was not translated until this particular inscription. And this is the inscription. You can see it's a very elegant carving on the side of this mountain, and it shows King Darius. Again, here he is with the same motif as you've seen for some of the other kings that are in these etchings. And you can see all these inscriptions, very small writing, but it's in 3 languages, and they all say the same thing. So this is how they were able to decipher some of these ancient languages that until that time had never been translated. And this governor, Tattenai, was a governor who lived in and reigned, was governor for about 20 years in the late 6th century BCE. And he ruled the area of Persia that included their province called Yehud, which is the Persian name for Judah. And this Tattenai, again, he's one of the most recent with those other 2 individuals. The 3 of them are the most recently identified personalities in the Bible whose corroboration is available now from evidence outside the Bible. And there's a tablet from a letter from Darius I that was recovered from Babylon that has his name to corroborate his reference in the book of Ezra. The last king of Persia we're going to deal with is probably the one you're most familiar with. This is Xerxes I. His name in the Bible, very famous, Ahasuerus. Now, some people may say that we're not sure if it's actually Xerxes or Artaxerxes, which is another king that I'm going to mention. But the answer is that this name is different from the name for Artaxerxes, who's the other king that followed him. So we know that Ahasuerus refers to this particular king. And he succeeded Darius I and ruled from Shushan, which is the famous capital that we have in the book of Esther. It was named of Susa. And actually, those of you that were with me a couple of years ago, and we discussed the archives from the ancient people at the time of the forefathers, Susa goes back thousands of years. It was actually the capital in Mari, and it's also now many, many centuries later is actually the capital of Persia, from which Ahasuerus or Xerxes reigned. And you can see that his kingdom was enormous, very well could have had 127 states or provinces as listed in the book of Esther. Again, he reigned over the largest extent of the Persian Empire in ancient history. And his exploits, including an invasion of Greece in the 5th century, and he crushed revolts in Egypt and Babylon. And here's Susa, there's his capital. And he's referenced not just in the book of Esther, but also in the book of Daniel. You see that in the chapter 9 of Daniel, it actually has a phrase there that in the year 1 of the reign of Darius, the son of Xerxes, that is Ahasuerus. And in Ezra, there's another reference to him where it talks about early in the reign of Xerxes, the king wrote an accusation against the people of Judah. So they were rebuilding their temple, but there were enemies of Judah who complained to King Xerxes that the Jews were not supposed to rebuild their temple because there were other people who existed there and should have jurisdiction over the Temple Mount. And these enemies sent a letter to Artaxerxes, the successor, whose name here in Hebrew is different from Ahasuerus. So we know that the Bible used a different name for this name. So Ahasuerus is definitely attributed to the name Xerxes. And these enemies sent a letter to this king who succeeded him with a similar complaint. However, the elders of Judah sent a letter back to Artaxerxes saying that they had the letter, they had these inscriptions, this evidence from Darius, from Darius, and from Koresh, from Cyrus, that allowed them to rebuild the temple. And so King Artaxerxes actually changed his mind and allowed them to continue. And he's famous, Xerxes is famous for a large construction. This is an enormous palace that he built. And there's this very famous gate called the Gate of All the Nations, which is also known as the Gate of Xerxes in one of the large cities of the Decapolis called Persepolis. And this is the etching here shows Darius appointing his son Xerxes as king of Persia. He's also identified in a French collector's vase. This is called the Caylus vase, which was discovered by a count of Caylus who found them in the ruins of one of the wonders of the ancient world, which is the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, currently located in Turkey. And on this alabaster jar is the name of Xerxes, and it's actually shown in one of the museums in Paris. And before we get into the last section, wonder how many of you will be able to identify, again, not a personality from the Bible, but somebody else very famous in history that you'll know his name, but I don't know if you've ever seen a photo of him. He actually at one time wrote for the Toronto Star. Ernest Hemingway, during his volunteer work in World War I. So we're going to come now to the final section, and I thought you might find this of interest. A lot of people have asked, how far back can we identify personalities in the Bible? Can we actually go back to Genesis? Can we go back to Bereshit, to the time of the forefathers and foremothers, or beyond that into the time of Joseph and so on? And the foremothers. So I'm trying to include some women in this, even though nobody is identified. We're also going to talk about Yerubbaal, who is known in the Bible by two names. His other name is Gideon. He's one of the judges. Also the pharaoh Ptah, who is not in anybody's list of people that have been identified. But I'm going to show you why I think, if you look carefully at the text, he may be there. And finally, Isaiah the prophet, which would be a very big find if he actually existed. So what about evidence for the forefathers? So we're going to talk now about very peripheral evidence from a couple of sources. One is that, just a couple of comments, when you're dealing with the names of Abraham, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Israel, the names are in early genealogy in the Bible, in the biblical history, and they're either personal names or eponymous names, which means they're from a tribe, a place, or a clan. So there's many people identified in those early chapters who are listed as biblical personalities, but bear the names of an actual place or a tribe from ancient history. They're identified as places rather than people. So it's interesting that these names in the Bible are derived from some of these sources. There's no direct evidence, I'll say that up front, for the existence of any of the named forefathers or foremothers. But we have to go back to actually know the dating. When did the patriarchs and matriarchs actually live? And this is one of my talks from 2 or 3 years ago. And if you want to get all the information of how the timing is identified, there's 6 sources. And these are the 6 sources that we use that help to date the time of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the foremothers. The identification, to just give you the bottom line, is probably from the time of the early 2nd millennium BCE. And a lot of the evidence comes what's called the Mari archive. It's from this archive from the ancient state of Mari, which is just now where Syria and Iraq exist now. And there's several sources from that archive that could help date, or very strongly date the time of the matriarchs. So this is, these were located, the state of Mari, you can see is shown here from the ancient states that existed at the time. And in those archives, which are in a site which is called also Tel Hariri, there are many names in that archive that start with the letter Yud. The letter Yud, or the Yud prefix, is identified in over 20% of male names of the time. And you can see that there's many names of people from the early biblical, from the Genesis genealogies, that have the letter Yud at the beginning of their names. So Yitzchak, Yishmael, Yaakov, Yosef or Joseph, and Yisachar, one of the sons of Jacob. So it helps to identify the commonality of those names. And again, we're looking at the patriarch-matriarch age from these various lines of evidence, which again, you can see and you can watch that particular discussion that I did, is probably from the first 200 years of the second millennium BCE. By the way, these other dates of the Garden of Eden, Noah's flood, are fairly strong evidence. There's no personalities from there that I've been able to discuss or confirm, but the locations and the timing, very strong evidence for that. And again, those are in a couple of my other talks. So actually going back to the names of the forefathers, whether it's Avram, whose original name was Avram before the Hay was inserted, and Isaac and Jacob. And I give you reference to this particular one, which is Kyle McCarter's chapter in a book that's still published and has actually a 4th edition about ancient Israel. And Avraham appears to be a personal name, so he was trying to decide whether the names of the forefathers were eponymous from a tribe or a place, or actually personalities. And he believes Avraham was actually a personal name, and the name Abiram or Abram was known from periods over almost a millennium, including from several inscriptions from the land of Amor, and also from the era where there are inscriptions that would be around contemporary with when Abraham should have lived. And in the campaign, there's actually evidence from Kings 1 and 2 Chronicles of the Pharaoh Shoshank, who is discussed, we discussed him last week. And in the middle or late 10th century BCE, he actually invaded Judah, and he encountered the king Rehoboam I. And there is a victory inscription that he left talking about the fortifications of Abraham, which means that this Pharaoh actually identified the location as having some reference in the distant past to a person by the name of Abram. So this is the closest that archaeologists have come to actually identifying an Abram, but it doesn't actually tell you the age at which this occurred or whether he's referring to a millennium before or some other person. How about Yitzchak? Again, we said the Yud at the beginning of his name is very common at the time. And the reference in Amos, the prophet Amos, one of the lesser prophets, referred to Israel by another name as well, both Israel and Yitzchak. And this is interchangeable in biblical Hebrew. The sin can sometimes be interchanged with a tzadi. And so there's a recollection of Isaac among the northern tribes. But again, it just identifies the name with a historical, let's say genealogical or historical identification. It doesn't identify the actual existence of this person and the between 2000 and 1800 BCE. So again, no direct corroboration. But what about the name Yaakov? The Yud prefix, again, very common among names, as we mentioned. And the Amorite name of Yaakov is known from the correct era. Now, we know the name exists. It's a common name, and it's a name that very well may have identified our forefather. However, there's no direct evidence of this particular person, and that's why Mekitiak in his anthology does not feel it meets the criteria of his 3 marks to actually make it a firm identification. The name Jacob El is known from various other sources, so that name does appear in Egyptian chronicles. And there's actually a tomb, a scarab, that was found by the archaeologist Aharon Kempinski in Shikmona in Israel, dated to the 18th century BCE with the name Jacob Har. So Jacob's name does appear in several sites, but the actual identification is not known. Again, the names of the matriarchs now, really there is no specific identification with no corroboration from historical or archaeological sources. But as I mentioned, the field is still open, and maybe at some time we will get corroboration of those names. A brief discussion about the name Yerubbaal. This is another fairly recent identification. His other name was Gideon ben Yoash, so you may know him better as Gidon, one of the judges, Gidon, and he's referred to in several spots, and he has his own 2 or 3 chapters in the book of Judges or Shoftim. And before he accepted God's commission, he had to get rid of the name Baal. That's probably why he's not identified in most of the chapters of Judges as Yerubbaal, but rather as Gidon, because his family, worshipped the god Baal, and he wanted to get rid of that in his name and change his name to Gideon. And he was a leader who battled the Midianites. And there actually is a pottery fragment that was found by a combined Australian and Israeli team in the forest of the Shaharia forest of the JNF. And this was identified in 2021. And it was found in a layer matching the time of David and the Philistines, in a layer matching the 11th century BCE that specifically has his name, the alternative name, Yerubbaal. And it was located near the biblical town of what's called Siklag, which is known from the time of David, it was given to David by the king of Gath by the name of Achish, and the name on this shirt is Yerubbaal. However, whether this is the Yerubbaal in the Bible, the timing is right, but a firm identification would need to have a little more evidence, and so it fulfilled 2 of the 3 marks that would give it a tentative identification as the famous name of Gidon. There's another personality from history, If you've never seen a photo of him, that is Hans Christian Andersen from the 1860s. Very rare. There are very few photos of him, so it's quite an identification. Now, I want to come to the possible evidence for this pharaoh, and this is going to be this is a bit of a surprise for some of you, because we're going to identify this pharaoh from biblical sources and from corroboration from Egyptian sources, and may identify him indeed as a 85th personality in the pantheon. He reigned, he was a pharaoh of Egypt for 10 years. He was the 13th son of Ramses II, thought to be the pharaoh of the Exodus. But all of his sons, Ramses reigned for like 70 years. Most of his sons were either died or were exiled, and so it took the 13th son to succeed him. And he was the father of the next pharaoh, who was Seti II. And there's a victory stele, which mentions the name of Israel for the first time. So the reason I wanted to bring him up is because his inscriptions identify the name Israel for the very first time. And it's actually dated to 1207 BCE. The inscription was found, this is a statuette of this pharaoh, by the way, but his inscription was found in Thebes, which was the capital of Egypt for many, many generations, by one of the most famous archaeologists of all time, Flinders Petrie. And this victory stele, which I show you here, is called the Meron Ptah stele. It's in the Egyptian Museum, one of the most famous archaeological artifacts of all time. And for us as Jews, one of the most famous and important ones of all time. So this is a photo of Flinders Petrie. And the stele actually talks about Meron Ptah's victory over several other nations, about Libyans and allies. But then he goes on to describe his separate campaign in the land of Canaan. And he includes several cities, Ashkelon, Gezer, and others in the territory of Ephraim, and also in the land of Judah. So he identifies several sites in this area of Israel, in the area which was the tribal allocations of Ephraim, Judah, and also Benjamin. And this is now matching the time of the judges. So Yehoshua, is thought to have lived and led the people of Israel, and the conquering was in the second half of the 13th century BCE, which is exactly corroborated by this stele. And the names of these cities are also corroborated in the book of Joshua. So now we mentioned the timelines here. I mentioned also that from pieces of evidence in one of my other talks, we identified the Exodus from Egypt by most scholars is probably dated to the first half of the 13th century BCE, which would then date Joshua and the settling of the tribes to the second half of that century, which all gels with this stele identified by this pharaoh. And the quote here is that Canaan has been plundered, Ashkelon has been overcome, Gezer has been captured, Yanom is made non-existent, and Israel is laid waste. That's this hieroglyphics here at this portion of the inscription. Israel is laid waste. So this is the first generally accepted as being the earliest identification of the people of Israel. So until then, there's no mention of the people of Israel by other external sources until this stele, and the dating is absolutely perfect to what is thought to be the time of the invasion. Now, in Joshua chapter 15, Joshua actually allocates land of the newly captured Israel. So Joshua led the campaign to capture the land of Israel, and after it was captured, they allocated the lands to the different tribes. And there's a passage in chapter 15 where he set the border for Judah from what's called the top of the hill to the spring of the waters of Nephtoah. This is the Hebrew in the book of Yehoshua, the book of Joshua, the Te'ar, etc., El Ma'ayan Me Nephtoah. Now, there's another reference 3 chapters later where he describes the allotment of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, notice Benjamin is down here with Judah in the same location that the stele, that Mereneptah actually located his campaign. So if he was located there during his campaign and the stele names him as having come from, as being there, it makes sense that there might be another reference to the pharaoh from the biblical side. Well, let's look at this other source. Here it says, Upeyat Negba, this is looking to the south side, Vayetze El Ma'ayan Me Neftoach, the same location, the spring of the waters of Neftoach. Now, here comes a reference from Biblical Archaeology Review over 30 years ago. There is a papyrus that is located and has been identified as having been written during Merenptah's 3rd year of his reign. And it describes Egypt's strategic places that it captured in Israel. It also tells of the arrival of a commander, an Egyptian commander from the wells of Merenptah, which are in the hills. Now, maybe some of you are starting to put this puzzle together. If you're talking about the wells of Merenptah, it means that there's a location known in Egyptian sources of the wells of Merenptah. Now, what does the Bible say? In Joshua 9 and 18, it says that these hills of Judah, remember hills again, here we go, hills of Judah and Benjamin in this location identified by Merenptah, they call in the Bible the spring of the waters of Neftoach. Now, that's a redundant phrase. And Professor Yurko, who's the author of this article, pointed out something very interesting. There's a location called the wells of Merenptah. The Bible calls something about the waters of Neftoach, but it says the spring of the waters of Neftoach, which makes no sense syntactically, because why say spring of waters of Neftoach? It should just say the spring of Neftoach. So Yurko makes this argument that if you say wells of Merenptah and spring of waters of Neftoach, maybe the script has been corrupted in some way, and this little yud in the original reference may have actually meant to be a resh. You can see the little yud has the same configuration as a resh, and in the little anecdotes that you read where there's little errors in the Bible, often a yud and resh are confused or interchanged. But let's say you put this resh here instead of the yud. Now what does the word say? It says the springs or wells of Merenptah. The spring or wells of Merenptah. This is the biblical name of Merenptah. So even though he's not identified as a person in the Bible who is corroborated, Yurko's argument that I'm showing you here is that this is actually the name of the pharaoh, but the scribes over the years interchanged a resh for a yud, and it shouldn't say the waters of Merenptah, it should say the waters or springs of Merenptah, which is exactly what this Egyptian cuneiform inscription said. So I'm showing you this as a way of looking at the exact Hebrew syntax, the exact Hebrew lettering, and how you could actually make a discovery that has passed by many, many people. So I've heard nothing about this since that time, other than the fact that Israel is identified in the stele, but this Merenptah stele actually corroborates the location of what Joshua's text says is the location and the timing of the wells of Merenptah, or the spring of Merenptah, and this may actually be a person who is actually identified in the Bible, if you accept his explanation. The last personality we're dealing with tonight is Isaiah. This is one of our prophets, one of the great prophets, the latter prophets. And we go back now to a piece of identification that was discovered a number of years ago by an excavation team from the Hebrew University, who discovered many seal impressions in a layer that was in the Ophel, which is beside the Temple Mount, by a team led by Eilat Mazar. So giving credit again to some very prominent female archaeologists who excavated in this area. This is Eilat Mazar, again, unfortunately died at a very young age. And one of the most famous archaeologists, the British dame Kathleen Kenyon, who excavated also in this area 20 years earlier. These are the sites of the identification. The city of David is here, and this is the Ophel, which is located here in the just beside the southern wall of the Temple Mount. These excavations you can see when you visit Israel. And here is the step structure. This is located in the city of David, which Kathleen Kenyon and also Eilat Mazar excavated. And this is where the bullae were discovered in the middle of this Ophel, which was described and built by King Yotam, also described in a couple of sources in the Bible, in Nehemiah and Chronicles. And in Chronicles, we get the quote that King Yotam built a gate to the temple above. So we know that this is the true location of what the Bible calls the Ophel. And I've shown you these three bullae from last week. We dealt with the one here, which belongs to Chezkiah. This is one of the identification marks of the king Hezekiah. But today we're going to look at one of the other ones, which is this one here. And the ancient Hebrew says belonging to Isaiah, possibly the prophet. This is where the problem of identification comes, because there's only the first two letters of that name. So we have the name Isaiah. We have this, it was found in the same layer as his king, which is Hezekiah, and both of them are mentioned at the same sources in Isaiah. So they're both linked in the biblical text and being linked historically, and both of their names are on these scarabs. The problem is that the archaeologists don't know where the Aleph is, and so they can't for sure claim that this is the biblical prophet, but it's probably as close as we're going to come until something more definitive is found. So we're coming now to the end. Here's another famous personality from history, again, and not a biblical character. That's a young Winston Churchill. So, did they exist? The answer is there's at least 57 confirmed persons. And with our investigation of Mer en Ptah, maybe you'll agree that, like I do, I feel that there's a 58th person, that the pharaoh Mer en Ptah is probably identified by Joshua and corroborated by his stele. So these are the various confirmed persons. I mentioned last week, we dealt with the first 4 sections here. And the timelines, what are the timelines? For those that are confirmed, they go back as far as 1010 BCE to King David, and as far forward as King Darius II in the around 404 BCE. If you look at the tentative persons, if you believe we can identify Mer en Ptah, then the timeline of identified persons goes back to the 13th century BCE, or even earlier if you identify King Balak from the discussion we had last week. And finally, though they don't have any confirmed identification, if you want tentative identification of the forefathers, that would take us back to 2000 BCE. So these are the sources. I mentioned Professor Mikitiak's confirming 50 plus 3 more people, and the various other sources that I've used. There's many other sources I've used, but these are the 10 most important ones. This is Yurko's article about Mer en Ptah, and this is the website, which is current as of 5 days ago. So I've been sort of canvassing that website, which is updated as they find new identified persons. But I brought you up to date as of 2017 with the most recent ones. Nobody has been added as of this week. This is something you all recognize, but may not have seen the actual place where the Great Wall of China ends. And that's because I'm ending. This is the series from the previous talks that I've given. This was either the first 8 talks, and to that I can now add these last 2 talks. So there now are going to be 10 talks up on the website. And to access them, you go to YouTube and put in the search of Beth David B'nai Israel Beth Am, which is our shul. You click the first icon and what you see, the label for the synagogue, you click that, it'll bring up a whole ream of over 200 videos. But at the top, you'll see the word playlists. If you click playlists, you'll find my lectures as the third or fourth item, and they'll all be there. And hopefully this one will be up as well. I believe the one from last week is now up. I think I saw it, but you'll find it in that group. If it's not in my playlist, it'll be certainly one of the first 2 or 3 when you get to the click the icon for the synagogue. So I'd like to thank my Beth David colleagues, Barbara and Helene, Rebecca, and Heather, and thank you for joining us. And I hope this tour of the Bible and the personalities has been of interest. And if you have any questions or comments, more than happy to take them now. And so for part 2, we have reached the end.
Thank you. Stephen, if you could disable your screen so we can see everybody, and if there's any questions. If you're don't want to ask questions using the mic, feel free to put it in the chat. I'll give people a few minutes.
Okay. Stephen, it's Anne.
Anne, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Saw your lovely grandkids on Saturday.
Yeah, they told me. Yeah, I was wondering what other sources from where you get your maps, like they're ancient maps, and where do you go to find them?
Like most of the pictures and photos, it's on Wikipedia and or Google Maps. Sorry, Google History. You can go, and when you also go to Wikipedia, they usually have various. You look it up on the on Google Scholar or any of the common websites, and usually there's several items there that you can click on, and they usually include maps with all their discussions. So you can find them in the again on Wikipedia or Wikipedia Commons, and you know, you can search for them under all of the different eras of history and the different states and countries and kingdoms.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, can I ask something? At the beginning, you gave a list of names that started with Yud, but Israel was not there. Why?
They didn't have room on the slide, and everybody knows Israel.
At the beginning, no, there was a list, and there was not Israel at the beginning. Okay,
No. It's where we're talking about the Yud prefix. Is that the one you're talking? Yeah. Because I actually I just gave those as examples. There are other names. There's other names beside Yisrael that have a Yud. But I was just trying to make the point in the discussion in the lecture on the patriarchs, the one that's on the playlist. Okay. It goes in. It goes into that Ruchama. It's all there. Don't worry. There's due credit to Yisrael.
It was wonderful. Kol hakavod.
Thank you.
Kol hakavod. I'll tell you, Yaakov is not a compliment. The name Yaakov and why he was called Yaakov. So Yaakov is not a compliment, but instead of this, Israel is okay.
It's like Gidon. He didn't want the name Baal in his name.
Yeah,
so he changed his name to Gidon. He must have been a movie star. You know, they all changed their names. So, you know, I guess his movie star in the movies, his name would be Gidon, so that he wouldn't be called Yerubbaal.
Thank you. Thank you for all your questions. I'm just aware of the time. On behalf of the Engaging in Education Committee, which is myself and Barbara, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Stephen again for his informative and interesting talk. It is quite evident for your love for history and archaeology. I'm so thrilled that you were able to share your labor of love, as you said at the beginning. I can definitely see a new career path if you ever decide to give up medicine, Stephen. Again, thanks for sharing tonight. Just on behalf of the Engaging Committee, sorry, there are two new exciting programs that are happening next week and the week after. We are having a Tu B'Shvat book talk with Jonah Musket Brown on February the 2nd at 8 o'clock. It will be on Zoom, and the topic is the courage to grow. And I guess we'll be talking about trees and the earth and growing. And the next one on February 8th, we are hosting Honest Reporting Canada, and they will be doing a workshop with us again on Zoom. And the topic is Learn to Fight Media Bias Against Israel. Please register online to get the links, and we hope to see you at those exciting events. And again, thank you for coming tonight and making it in the snowstorm. I know it's hard on Zoom to get out, but thanks for your presence.
Thank you. It was excellent.
Thank you very much. Very
Excellent.
interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much,
Thank you,
Stephen.
Stephen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.